So the first thing I'm going to show you is the Sculpt Deformer, which is, it's really useful. You normally see it when people demo it in doing like, if you have a bug under your skin or something, or a little bulge that had to move around, that's what you would use a Sculpt Deformer for. But the other application that's less known is you can use it to do like surface contact from your rig to some solid object like a table. Like, you know how your hand squishes down a little bit when you touch a table or something? I can show both of those applications. I have my example file here that I already made. So I've got this donut, and it is not just modeled that way. You can lift it up and down off of the surface, and it will, in real time, collide with this surface. So to set that up, I will open up my demo file. Hold on. I've got just a regular polygon cube, and I have a torus here with a good amount of subdivisions. If you don't have a good amount of subdivisions in your model, this will not work because it needs some resolution to actually squish. The place you find this deformer is in the Deform menu set. All the deformers that we're going to use are in the Deform menu, which you can find in either modeling or in rigging. I'm going to be in rigging just because I'm a rigger and we might need to get some skeleton joints later. So I'm going to select the object that we're going to be the colliding object and go to Deform, Sculpt, Options box. The options you have here are kind of confusing, but don't worry about it because a lot of it we're going to end up tweaking in the history to suit our needs. The one thing I like to have selected is Group Sculptor with Locator. What this is going to give us is it's going to give us two nodes, one of which is a locator that's called your origin, and one of which is like a sphere-looking thing called a sculptor. The sculptor is the object that actually is creating the surface your mesh collides with, and the origin is telling it how much to squish, and it's based on the distance between the origin and the sculptor. However, if you want to move it around initially, you need to move them together, which is why we're grouping them in the options. I'm going to create, and you'll see we've got this group Sculpt Group 1, and it gives us a little sphere, which is our sculptor, and our origin, which is a locator. And you'll see, right now it's in the middle of the donut. I'm going to scale it up a little bit so you can see what it does. But first I'm going to center the pivot so that we're basically moving everything right from the origin of where it is. When you scale it up, you can see it start to collide from the inside. And then if you move it inside of the donut, you can see it start to like poke at the surface. This might even be more obvious in a smooth preview. This is how you could see the effect of like, oh, there's something crawling under my skin. Gross. So what I'm going to do with this is take it and take the group specifically and take it down into our surface. I'll go into wireframe so it's a little easier to see. And we're just going to try and scale it and match it so that it matches our surface that we're contacting with. It does not have to be exact. It just has to look good enough when you try it. So this would probably be good. So if I take our donut and move it down, it's going to look really strange at first because right now we have our origin and our sculptor in the exact same position. To give it a little bit of fall off, you just take your origin and move it down until you're getting a displacement that looks kind of normal. Then, once you've messed with that, you can go into the history on your model and you'll have all those options from the options box. And what I usually like to do is turn up the drop-off distance just a little bit, turn up the displacement just a little bit, and then play with that and the origin length until you get an effect that works for you. You can also take your group and scale and move it until you're getting something that looks nice. Yeah, I kind of like how that looks. It's poofing out a little too much for my taste, and so I would go and adjust the maximum displacement to like 0.15. And that's really all there is to it. It's pretty easy to use. You just have to like tweak it until you get something you like. And you could use this for like, I have a hand or a leg that's contacting with a table or a chair. I used this on my 3D production film when I had one of my Muppets' hands was on a desk. And it would dynamically collide with the desk along with the Muppet's chest. You could also probably build this into a rig if you wanted. You just have to be careful about your history. For all these deformers, when you're doing something on top of an existing rig, you want to make sure it comes after the skin cluster so that your skin cluster can do its deformation and then the deformer will apply in addition to that. It's the opposite of what we do with blend shapes and facial rigging when you put it beforehand. So the next thing I'm going to do is called a sliding wire deformer, which I just think looks pretty cool and would be good if you're setting up a prop or something that has to wiggle but maintain its volume. So my example for that I have two guys here. One of them is set up with a normal wire deformer and one of them is set up with a sliding wire deformer. The wire deformer essentially takes a Nurbs curve and it uses that Nurbs curve as a deformer so that when you move around its CVs, it'll move the geometry it has influence over. So the normal wire deformer just looks like this. It doesn't really preserve the volume. You can see like goofy stuff happening with his arms. The sliding wire gets you a deformation like this. I just sort of did it on a guy because it's fun, but this would actually be useful in a case where you had like a palm frond waving or some other prop thing that you wanted to rig up really fast. You don't have to paint any skin weights for this. So I'm going to go in and grab my setup file. Alright, I just have my Geo here. He's all in a group. His name is Joe. He's a rig I got from one of those Anim School-esque animation online classes. I forget which one, but I think they're in Thailand. The rigs are free. The first thing I'm going to do is make a Nurbs curve using the, I think EP curve tool was what I was using. Yeah, using the EP curve tool, I'm going to make a Nurbs curve. In the options, I'm going to make sure it's a linear curve because what we're trying to get is just a curve with 3 points where when you pull around the middle, it'll make like a triangle and the other 2 points will stay where they are. So I'll put one of my EP points at the top, one in his middle, and one at his feet. And what you should get is a curve that has 3 CVs, and when you pull it around, you get this kind of deformation. You want to make sure that you do not delete history on this, because the way we're able to get the effect is by keeping the history. Now that you have this curve, which I'm going to name wire base curve, you will grab that middle CV and create a cluster. I don't know if you're all familiar with a cluster deformer, but it's basically you can take some points, basically any kind of point, a CV or a like a polygon vertex, and it makes a deformer that gives it a transform node so you can pull it around. Go to Deform, Cluster, and now we have this zeroed out transform node that is the cluster that'll pull around that CV for us. Now that we've got that, let's apply this curve as a wire deformer to our mesh. The way you set up a wire deformer is a little bit different from how you set up other deformers, and this like had me stumped for a while until somebody explained it to me. When you make it, you don't select anything. You just click wire, and then you have to select all your geo and press enter. You get like instructions in the bottom left. Then you select your curve and press enter, and then you have your wire deformer. It duplicates your curve so that you have a base and a curve that you're manipulating, and it hides the base. The way it calculates is by looking at the difference between the base and the manipulating curve and deforming the geometry that way. However, when we look at this how it is right now, it's going to look really ugly. Because by default, wire deformers have a drop-off distance of like nothing. All we have to do is select one of the pieces of geometry and go into the attribute editor and go and find in the history your wire and go to drop-off distance. It's set to 1. I always set it to at least like 10. That way, with our cluster now, we're getting this deformation, which is sort of similar to what I showed you for the base. The way we get that smooth fall off is by rebuilding this curve. We're going to rebuild it from a linear curve all the way to a cubic curve that has smoothing on it. So when you're rebuilding curves, you go into the modeling menu set and go to curves, rebuild, and pick your settings. So I'm going to make it, it's going to be a cubic curve with, I think like, I'll do 8 spans, that's a good number. There's some other settings in here that we can tweak from the history once we know what it looks like. Whoop. Hello. I don't know why you're doing that, buddy. Oh, wait. You had to rebuild it before you made the wire deformer. That's okay. We are going to delete this. We'll just delete the history on the model. The nice thing about wire deformers is that it keeps your original curve. So even though we deleted all the deformer elements, we still have this curve so we can work with it. I'm going to, like before, just make the cluster again, and then rebuild this from there. Modify, curves, rebuild, 8 spans, apply. Yeah, so now what we're getting is the deformation we're going to be looking for, where it's keeping almost the same deformation that we were getting because of that history, but it has more spans, so we are able to like smooth it out. Now we make our wire deformer. Same way we did before. Deform wire, select geo, enter, select wire, enter. And what we get is that thing where we have to turn off the fall up, or turn up the fall off again. So find it. 10. Yeah. And that's the default sliding wire. The nice thing you can do is in your rebuild settings, if you don't like how those arms are stretching out, you can turn up this smooth to like 2. And you get a much nicer deformation. Then you can play with that. The other thing you can do is initially when you're making your clusters, you can make a cluster for the top and bottom as well, and then you have full control over it. It's almost like a ribbon spine, except it doesn't have the twist attribute that you get from a ribbon spine. But also, you don't have to paint any skin weights, make any follicles, whatever. Super simple. Alright, the last thing I have to show you is making squash and stretch with a lattice. Antonio knows that I use this method to take a rig that was like already totally done and put squish on the head without having to mess with any of the joints or like make any new skin binds, paint anything. It's just in the history a lattice on top of all your skin clusters and blend shapes. The other nice thing about it is if you have rig controls, it'll deform the rig controls so that they stay on the rig even when you're deforming it with the lattice, and it also won't give them any transformations. So it just looks nice visually. So what I've got here is just a cylinder that I've skinned up with a couple of joints so that we have a basic rig. And then on top of that, we have a cluster on the top and bottom that is automatically giving us squash and stretch. You can also pull it in all directions. And if you take the rig controls and move them, the cluster will respect that and squish it in its deformed state and move the controllers along with it. So I will show you how to set that up. Of these three things, it takes the longest, but also it still doesn't take very long. Let's start. All right. I did all the rig bits already, so I have joints in there that I can show you. It's just 3 FK joints, 3 FK controls, skinned to a cylinder. And so we're just going to be doing the part where you make the lattice. The first thing you're going to want to do is grab your geo and also grab only your base parent control. If you grab all the controls when you're selecting it, you'll get a double transform on the controls and they'll shoot off into space. So only select the main parent that has all the FK children and the geo. If you have more than just FK controls on your rig, grab at least enough so that everything is selected or its parent is selected. Then I'm going to go into the Deformers and create a lattice, and it'll be a 2x2x2 lattice. So it'll just give us a cube. We don't have any divisions in there. And then what we get is this lattice that we can manipulate. It'll manipulate our controls and it'll manipulate our geo, but it won't give the controls any transforms. Now, we'll run into this issue where, well, first thing I'm going to do is I want clusters on the top and bottom. So I'm just going to do that quickly so that we can move our lattice points and be able to zero them out. That's the reason to use clusters, because if you're just moving around lattice points in general, you don't have any way of resetting them. But with a cluster, you get a transform node, so you can. So say I were to take this cluster and put it into a squished state. If I took the controls as they are now and were to take them out of the lattice, you'll get this fun glitch where now that the control is out of the lattice is no longer processing it, and so it tries to go back to its initial state. All you have to do to fix that is go into the attribute editor on the lattice and find its node. It'll be named FFD1 or FFD whatever number lattice you have. And that's based on the lattice and base that is created whenever you make a lattice deformer. It's the same way as the wire, where it creates the base and it creates the one you manipulate and it calculates the difference between the two. The one you're going to toggle is there's an attribute called outside lattice. Right now it's set to inside, which means everything inside the lattice gets affected, and if it's outside the lattice, it'll try and go back to its initial state. We'll change this to all. That way, everything, no matter where it is in world space, will get affected by the lattice if its geometry is assigned to the lattice, which right now our whole thing is. The other thing you can do is create a fall off, which is kind of interesting looking, where it'll create an area of a little cloud around it where it'll fall off the lattice influence. That could be useful if you're trying to blend your lattice with some non-deformed geometry. But usually, just to account for every possible situation, I go for all. Now, right now, we're getting scaling in Y with our squash and stretch, but we're not getting any of the other axes like we had in the example. And the way you can set that up is just set-driven keys. You could probably do a more complicated node-based setup as well if you wanted to have a slider that can control the amount of squash and stretch. But just for a simple one, I like to use set-driven keys. They're easy to understand. You can go and tweak them in the graph editor. I'm going to save this because Maya has been very bad about crashing when using set-driven keys lately. I want to be able to go back to this. So set driven keys, this was created by the student version of Maya. Set driven keys are in the animation menu set. They should be in the rigging menu set, and they're not, and it makes me angry. In this case, our driver is going to be the top cluster. We're going to set this up for both the top and the bottom, and it's going to be essentially identical. But for the first one, our Y translation is going to be driving the scales on the clusters. And that's how we're going to get the effect of it squishing and stretching when you bring it up and down. And the other two axes of transformation aren't going to affect the scales, so you can pull it around like as much as you want. Our driver right now is cluster 1 hail translate Y, or cluster 1 handle translate Y. And our driven is going to be both clusters scale Z and scale X, which is just the scale axes that are parallel to this ground plane. So the first key I'm going to set is just neutral. Right now the translate Y is at 0 and all the scales are going to be at 1. And then you only need to set 2 keys because we're going to set it up so that it has an infinite linear relationship and it'll scale no matter what. So you only really need 2 keyframes to set up that relationship. So do we want to stretch it or squish it? I'll let you choose. It doesn't really matter. You want to squish it? Cool. We'll take this down -5. And then I will grab these 2 clusters and scale them. Tell me when. Yeah, tell me when. Okay. You guys are nuts. That's way too much. Maybe about there?
A bit more.
A little bit more?
Yeah, it's more saturation.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna set this to an even number so that I can remember it when we do it on the other one. 2.65. That's 1.65. 2.65. And key. Then we can go into the graph editor and see that relationship when we click on the cluster. I'll click on both. Right now we have a spline relationship. I'm sure you guys are familiar that when you have set-driven keys, you don't want it to be a spline relationship or auto tangents because you'll get easing and you'll get double easing when it gets keyframed by the animator. So we're going to set this, it's actually what we want is tangent spline, but it makes it a linear relationship. We don't want to do just linear because what it'll do is give us flat tangents on the end and we want it to continue into infinity. So you have to do tangent spline. And then to get our infinite relationship, I'm going to show infinity wherever that is. View infinity. Yeah. Right now, it is staying constant into infinity, but we can tell Maya pre-infinity, linear, and then post-infinity, linear. So now, when we pull this cluster up and down, it's going to stretch like crazy because y'all have no self-control. If you wanted to adjust that relationship, all you would have to do is click on these clusters and in the curves, you can just bring this down and make that relationship a little more chilled out. That looks pretty good. And so let's find out, yeah, when we're at -5, our scales are going to be at 1.759. I'll copy that value because we're going to do the exact same thing on this bottom cluster. But I'll go through it really fast since we saw it already. The other nice thing about driven keys in contrast to direct connections is that if you have 2 different driven key curves on a single attribute, like we're going to have 2 different controls for the scale X and scale Z on these clusters, it blends them for you instead of not letting you overwrite it. So I will key this at 0, And then I will bring this time I'm going to bring it up 5, because when this cluster goes up, we want it to squish the overall length of the cylinder is decreasing. And then on these guys, on their scales, I'm going to set it to that value we copied from earlier. And I will do the same thing with our keys. Tangents, spline, pre-infinity, linear, post-infinity, linear. And so now these clusters give us a squash and stretch relationship. And you can actually sort of account for one with the other, because they work independently, but they're additive. All right, that's everything I have for you guys today. Have you got any questions?
Where do you set the set driving key window?
It's in the animation menu set, you go to key, set driven key, and then set. That's the easiest way to get to it. You can also get to it from the channel box somehow that I always forget.
Is in edit?
Is it edit?
Set.
Oh yeah, set driven key, and you have to have some sort of attribute selected or it won't open. All right, any other questions? All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.